Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from TBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 85th episode. Today, we will talk about India. Our guest is Ila Patnaik, Chief Economist, Aditya Birla Group, an Indian multinational conglomerate that has been in operation for 165 years. Earlier, Ila was a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. She has also served as Principal Economic Advisor at the Indian Ministry of Finance. Ila has authored numerous research papers in the field of economics and finance, and recently she did something unusual for an economist. She co-authored a book with the serving Union Minister of India, Bhupender Yadav. The book is called The Rise of the BJP, The Making of the World's Largest Political Party. Ila Patnaik, welcome to Kopi Time.
Thank you, Timur. Pleasure to be here. It's always a delight to speak to you.
Delight from my side as well. We'll talk about the book a bit later. First, let's go over a couple of issues on the matters of India economy in general. So how are global inflation and interest rate developments affecting India?
So currently, primarily through the exchange rate, because every time the US Fed moves, Indian rupee gets hurt, markets worry. So at the moment, I think, if you're familiar with some of my work on business cycles and the coupling and decoupling of business cycles between the US cycles and the Indian cycles, we typically see that they don't move perfectly in sync. So first, financial variables tend to move, and then later, real variables tend to move. So, currently the US economy is, well, maybe we can say overheating. So India is also doing well. I think later we'll get to see whether, if and when there is a monetary policy induced recession, how that affects India and how we slow down or not slow down and how much. But currently it's mainly, our exports are doing well. And when the Fed hikes rates, and, that's the dollar strength primarily. As the dollar is stronger, obviously there's pressure on the rupee as well. So that's been...
So in terms of a broader set of financial market variables like dollar spreads for Indian companies wanting to borrow in hard currency or the other sort of, liquidity indicators, you haven't seen the dollar strength spill over into that?
I mean, I think currently we are looking okay. So India is, in fact, one of those, the RBI intervened, the rupee didn't move all that much. But we've also been keeping up with, the RBI has been hiking rates, though not as much as the US Fed. And I think currently, in fact, there seems to be a lot of interest in India. There seems to be money coming in, and things look pretty good at the moment.
No, it is interesting, Ila, because when I look at year-to-date currency movements, the fragile five are nowhere to be seen, whether it is Indonesian rupee or Indian rupee. They have all outperformed their neighbors in the north. So Korea, Taiwan, Japan's currencies have depreciated sharply. But I sort of worry that as the dollar cycle continues and the depreciation trends become more pronounced among the industrial economies, that it might spill over into emerging market economies. So looking at the last 3 months of this year, do you have any concerns on the currency side, or you think that India has sufficient buffers in place to deal with any possible turbulence?
I would actually be happy to see the RBI allow the rupee to depreciate a bit, because that's what will allow the adjustment to happen. So, it'll make the rupee a little more competitive if they do allow us to depreciate. So, and I think in the last 3-4 trading days, that has happened. So the rupee was allowed to move, and the economy needs an adjustment mechanism, and the rupee is the ideal one. I mean, you hear all these demands for increasing custom duties, for anti-dumping duties, and because industry is hurting in many ways, and we might think that one concern that has been there is that we keep the price of oil low. But then oil is not the only thing whose price remains low. Once you keep the rupee strong, then other imports come in, and then industry starts worrying about their competitiveness. So I would think that to let a currency move is actually much, 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 much better than to pick and choose which industries get protection and which don't. And overall, I mean, I'm coming from the last, 20, 30, 40 years of Indian industry, when there have often been policies to pick and choose industries. So we don't want that trend to come back. And I think India would do better with a more competitive exchange rate. So
of course, more competitive exchange rate when other currencies are depreciating, it could create some sort of a bigger than neighbor type spiral, but you were in favor of letting the market decide on that. But Ila, what about balance sheet considerations or risk of foreign currency mismatch among certain importers, or the substantial pickup in US dollar borrowing in recent years? Do those indicators show any signs of concern from your side?
Not really. No, not this time around. So last time around there were concerns, but this time around, if you look at the last 2 years, corporate balance sheets have improved, and in fact, bank balance sheets have improved. So domestic banks are there ready out to lend to Indian companies when they want to borrow. The concern about unhedged foreign currency exposure is not all that much, because companies have also learned in this last few years that when there is trouble around the corner, if you have a natural hedge, then you take on currency exposure. Of course, there may be a couple of companies which may have taken more exposure, but broadly, this is not a time when we are worrying as much about that. About financial stability concerns arising out of unhedged dollar borrowing. That we've not actually the last 2 years have seen a lot of deleveraging. So it's not as if Indian companies have been borrowing away and investing and growing, and the entire pandemic period was one where they deleveraged. So that's not a primary concern, which is exactly why I'm balancing it out and saying that maybe a time to let the rupee move and to let it depreciate. I mean, there is pressure. The pressure is already there, and it may not make a lot of sense to resist that pressure, which is what RBI has been seen to be doing. So I think overall, balancing both things out, it's good if we depreciate. With the market. I mean, I'm certainly not saying that, we try to push it into depreciation, but if there is pressure, we don't keep losing reserves and trying to keep the rupee strong.
Right. Ila, I've been talking to you about exchange rate issues for a long time, so I know exactly where you're coming from in that regard. And it's good to hear that you feel that these vulnerability metrics have gone in the right direction since the taper tantrum days of 2013. You touched a bit on the pandemic. That's exactly where I wanted to go with my next question. From a policy environment perspective, I mean, how do you assess the Indian government's policy response over these two very challenging pandemic years?
So I think we were very sensible. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of pressure on the Indian government to start spending more. In fact, many economists said, especially those in the West, said that India should print money and do 10% of deficit as, do transfers up to 10% of GDP. So the fiscal deficit could be allowed to go up to 10% or maybe even more. Now, all that did appear to be very attractive at that time, because, you thought the world was going to end and this was just it. And if we save it now, then we are done. And that it's almost as if there was only going to be one wave of COVID, and then you had to just save the world. Now, the government did not take that advice. What the government did was that it tried to do structural reforms. So you're familiar with that Atmanirbhar package that for 5 days the finance minister announced various kinds of reforms. Some went through, some didn't go through. Tried to give credit support, tried to give food directly to households, but essentially not do the kind of fiscal transfers which some other countries like the US did. And by not doing that today, we are not suffering the kind of demand-side inflationary pressures, the large, households having withdrawn from the market, the labor market, the kind of stuff that we are seeing in the US. So we had a far more fiscally prudent, sensible fiscal policy. Now, I think that fundamentally there are two big reasons why we could do that. So, I'm not trying to say that the others were wrong in doing what they did. They did what they thought was best in their country. But one is that we didn't have that much fiscal space. I mean, once you start borrowing too much, you spill over onto the current account, or you start borrowing from abroad, and nobody's going to lend us in rupees the way the dollar borrowing can increase. So we didn't have that much fiscal space. But on the other hand, we did have space to do structural reforms. Okay, there are many things where markets still don't function in India, and one could do many things. And I think there's another social aspect of it, which is that when, say, someone in the US loses a job, they lose health insurance, they lose their house. Whereas, the way our society still is, the biggest crisis was migrants going back home. It was not homelessness. They had homes and they wanted to walk back, and they were not allowed to do that. And that was seen as a very, 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 very big crisis. But I'm just saying that in contrast to some economies where people would have, gone to hospital, lost all their savings in life because there was just private healthcare and no government healthcare. So I'm talking of the US, or they would have also become homeless. So given that we have a different kind of society, and given that our household balance sheets are very different and family ties are very strong, our crisis was people wanting to go home and us not being allowed to do that, which is a different kind of crisis. So the way it was handled, so one can always, with the benefit of hindsight, criticize this was not done properly, or that was not done properly, or what could have been done better. Sure, there are many things that can be said about that. But I think fundamentally the fact that we did not go overboard on fiscal expenditure.
So it was
so that I think is what saves us today, and we are seeing far more macroeconomic stability post the pandemic in India, and therefore India remains a fundamentally attractive destination, that which would not have been the case had we gone overboard on our fiscal.
I'll talk a bit with you later on about the informal sector in India and whether there was some scarring around the pandemic. But I want to talk about something else before that, since we are just talking in terms of policy response with respect to the pandemic. The government did deliver some of the emergency measures through the digital route and through some of the new modes of delivery. And as you know, there's been a lot of talk around the world about the pandemic hastening digital adoption. So talk about that in the context of India. I mean, how fundamental has been that transformation over the last few years?
I mean, it's staggering, actually. So we built, when the system was built, the UPI, payment systems were built, when Aadhaar was built, when the Jan Dhan accounts were opened, where everybody, the financial inclusion or bank accounts were about 50% people had bank accounts in 2014. So when all that was done, it was not done with the objective of what we would do during the pandemic, obviously, because nobody knew about the pandemic. And it was done either for, financial inclusion, or it suddenly increased during post-demonetization, or it was made popular by, creating interoperability between different payment systems. And that was that was just done because it was good economics, good principles, good regulatory principles, preventing monopolies. And so you bring about interoperability. I mean, interoperability was so important that when we did it, I can, because we were all part of the ministry and we were working on it, we did not understand how important it is going to be to save millions of lives and livelihoods, which it happened to do during the pandemic. Because now here, there was a time when there was no way one could have gone out to the market, paid somebody to do something. One would just pay online and things would move. And it was just even today, you see that today behavior has shifted. So when people go out, they use digital payments, and it's a different country, as if it's a different country.
Ila, there is some data that show that India's informal sector has been struggling under pressure to formalize. So this is independent of the pandemic, but of course the pandemic also brought in its share of challenges for the informal side of the economy. So I think some of the stuff that we talk about in terms of the positive growth momentum probably largely covers the activity in the formal sector. Talk a little bit about where the informal sector stands.
The informal sector, there's a very large part of India that is very low productive. And when the GST was introduced, actually, that is the turning point.
Yes.
Because you think of somebody who's, let's say, selling vegetables, or even a carpenter. If their value added is less than, let's say, a carpenter who makes furniture, if his value added, he was in the informal sector, if his value added was less than 12%, and if 12% was the GST rate, then he had to it made no sense to continue to continue his business. If he was better off selling his business, shutting that down, investing money, even putting money in a bank, in a savings account, or investing it in the stock market. So what happened for the informal sector actually started much before, started 5 or 6 years ago when the GST was introduced. Now, was it good? Was it bad? No, I think all economies are always trying to move towards reallocating resources towards more productive businesses, and slowly over time to push out less productive businesses. I think the pandemic accelerated that. So maybe some of that would have happened, but it would have happened more slowly. With the pandemic, the informal sector got hit very sharply. And the formal sector recovered while the informal sector didn't recover. And so you see that shift happening in favor of the formal sector compared to the informal sector. So, that's broadly, it's a picture which is in some sense not so bad, because this was something that was going to happen, but it does feel a little, oops, we didn't expect it to happen so fast.
And do we see that manifest in weak consumption dynamic at the low end of the income spectrum?
See, things are picking up for people. So people are coming back into the labor market. Investment is picking up. Now, there is a lot of skill mismatch that has happened. So the jobs that are being created thanks to the high growth of the formal sector are not those that can be filled by the people who lost their jobs. So that's pretty clear, that you see numbers of, let's say, female labor force participation has dropped sharply. I mean, in India, we don't measure unemployment properly. So what and we'll continue to, I think, look at things like female labor force participation, because a lot of the stuff that they might have been doing, low skill jobs, the jobs are no longer there. They just drop out. They don't say that they're still searching for a job. So they don't count as part of the labor force, and they don't count as being unemployed. But actually, they've lost their jobs and they are unemployed. But they can't be absorbed in these high-skilled jobs where there are vacancies. So, for example, you'll hear about software, the IT sector, where people are moonlighting, where one person is doing 4 jobs, where all kinds of, where wages are extremely high, wage growth is very high. People are happy to just walk out of jobs and quit because they know that, within a day, they'll find another job. But there is a skill mismatch. So you do see that. And that's a problem.
Right. Now, when I saw you, I think 3 weeks ago, I was telling you that when you open a physical newspaper in India, you can see every day that the energy sector is expanding, taking advantage of the current geopolitical dynamic and securing, cheaper energy supply from Russia. But at the same time, you read all these stories about how European or American foreign direct investment is coming to India, part of the China Plus One policy. Of course, all of those are facilitated by the improvement in infrastructure as well. So walk us through your view on this issue. I mean, does this mean that this coming decade would be the decade of manufacturing-based pickup for India?
So let me first start with putting my biases on the table, because Aditya Birla Group is largely a manufacturing group, and we produce things like cement, aluminum, we are into textiles, and many paints, chemicals, many other things. And we see India growing, and we see the domestic market growing. We also see Indian companies getting a bigger share of global markets thanks to China Plus One. So ours is a multinational company that also works in Europe and America. And we see localization there. So we are more into inputs. And so we see companies turning to us compared to China or Chinese companies, even a little bit. So, the share of the market is the global market is very big. And, India's share in world trade is very small. So for us, a little more manufacturing is actually going to be very big. So yes, I do see this coming decade as one in which manufacturing will grow. I mean, we've seen services grow very fast in the past, but this increased realization and the government at least trying to put a lot of effort into what can be done to improve logistics, improve infrastructure, and to help manufacturing improve. I hope it'll all pay off.
Let's expand on that a little bit more. So, of course, as the China Plus One strategy takes place, given India's large population, we are experiencing and will likely continue to experience seeing substantial rise in foreign direct investment. So to your point that the government is making efforts to provide the right logistics infrastructure, what is your sense of the state of human capital and physical infrastructure in India to absorb a very sharp pickup in FDI?
See, a lot of the FDI is coming into the domestic market because it is the most promising, most fastest growing domestic market expected to be in the next decade or so. So you see e-commerce, you see things, people like Amazon coming. There is interest not merely in where China would have got. So where you think of hard infrastructure and manufacturing, where China attracted a lot of foreign capital. I think what India is attracting today is a lot of foreign capital in things like, as I said, for example, in e-commerce, which is service sector,
right,
which is very different from that traditional sort of thinking that that's where money is going to come. I think we have a huge capacity to absorb that the capital coming in. It may or may not come into large greenfield projects, because that's where I think India has had most difficulties. But when it is into M&A, so we are seeing money come in, we are seeing private equity come in. So the FDI, so I don't know how familiar you are with the FDI definition and how that changed a few years ago. So, anything over 10% in a company is pretty much FDI. So because the OECD definition used to be more than 10% in a country, then slowly we also changed that. So, the FDI flows that are coming in are a lot of private equity, a lot of money coming into companies, buying up companies and in M&A. So yes, that is, I think we do have the capacity to absorb but you do know that I don't think we're going to be very comfortable to have capital flows beyond 3% or so of GDP. So while we do want to attract foreign investment, but ultimately it won't be like 10% of GDP or very large numbers. And if you're talking 3-4%, we are able to absorb it easily. And that's the total amount, of course.
And your point of, not drawing a line at the 3-4% is that would allow for macroeconomic stability to be maintained, not have overheating issues, not resource misallocation, but still provide foundation for organic strong growth.
Yeah. To have macro stability, I would not say that this is where we should remain in the coming decades. This is a number that can increase. But, given our capacities, institutional capacities, given the pace at which we have been growing and how comfortable we are with a certain level of rupee depreciation, a certain level of interest rates, so there is this path dependence that we have. So given that, that's what I would expect.
So roughly speaking, in dollar terms, that would be in the range of $55 to $65 billion a year in the coming near term years, right? That's the kind of number we have in mind. Okay, Ila, for the longest time I've known you, you have been working very, very hard on what is known in India as a FSLRC. So for the benefit of the audience here, so this is the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission. You've been a member of that from the very beginning. And I understand that, through these years of, efforts made by you and others, we've had some landmark reforms implemented. So would you please share with us that journey that you've had and where you see the financial sector reforms presently?
So the journey, first let me correct you, I was not a member of FSLRC. I was only co-leading the research team that supported FSLRC. So the members were wise senior justices and former governors and so on. So we were the research team at it. So having said that, let me just take a couple of minutes to talk about what is typically the process through which reform happens. And that's very critical to FSLRC and what was done and what will be done in terms of financial sector reforms. So in general, if there's a problem, then people kind of look at governments, banks complain, various regulators complain, various people complain, public complaints, people write about, this is a problem. Research gets done, people make some noise, and then typically the government sets up a committee. Particularly in the 2000s, this is something that started in the 1980s, and there used to be all these trade committees. And, Ishar Jajaluwalia would say that, so she was an expert on trade, and she would always say that most of what was done in 1991 had already been written in various committees of the Government of India. So she and I have a joint paper together where we've kind of outlined each of the things that had been recommended by committee. So, whether it was doing away with industrial licensing or trade import licensing, rupee depreciation. So a lot of what was what was done in 91 under the aegis of the IMF and the structural the loan and so on had already been recommended by committees. And that committee process allows for a consensus to develop. Now, coming to financial sector reforms, a number of committees all the way from beginning in the 90s to during the financial crisis. So these were committees on you're familiar with the Raghuram Rajan Committee on Banking. There was a Percy Mystery Committee on making Mumbai an international financial center. Then there were various mini Rangarajan committees. There was a Tarapur Committee on Open Capital Account. There was a UK Sinha Committee on rationalizing capital controls. There were committees on the Debt Management Office, Jahangir Aziz's Committee on the Debt Management Office. Now, all of them were saying that something is wrong with the Indian financial system. There's lack of financial inclusion. Credit hardly reaches small businesses unless there are too many mandates. There's too much arbitrariness by regulators. The regulation making process is broken. There are no appeals mechanism other than SEBI had an appeals mechanism, but the other regulators didn't have appeal mechanisms. Insurance penetration is barely 3% and is not increasing because of various difficulties and so on. So now all of this put together was suggesting that India needs many reforms. And then it was understood, and that's where we were also part of the research team that was supporting the Department of Economic Analysis at the Ministry of Finance that time. It was understood that it needs legislative reform. So you can't just keep tinkering away at regulations, because regulations are made under certain powers that are given to regulators to make those regulations, and reforms are required beyond that. So the government set up
the landmark efforts you see in the pipeline in the coming this year or the next.
So I think the effort to do the FRDI, the Resolution Authority, it went up to standing committee, and I think that will come back, because you do need to, if you allow private banks to come in, you do need to have a mechanism where if they fail, any bank fails, then it's an orderly mechanism. And for that, it went till the last stage, and I always see some murmur somewhere or the other where there is an attempt to bring it back and talk about it. Especially after IBC, which is for non-financial firms primarily. It's been working for the insolvency and bankruptcy code. It's been working for non-financial firms. So after that, there has been this sense that, yes, you do also want to allow banks to have a mechanism through which they can be orderly resolution if they are on the brink of bankruptcy, rather than to just allow so we've typically had the RBI made somebody buy up a bank. So you can't keep doing that, especially if you're going to allow more banks to come in, or you don't allow banks to come in, and then you're again in this situation where barely 4 to 6% of bank credit goes to small companies, which is really not the optimal way to grow for a country.
Right. Okay. We'll look forward to that. Ila, let's talk about your book. How did it come out, and how does an economist collaborate with a politician?
So it was a very interesting story. After the 2019 election, I used to be writing columns at the print, and I was looking at, so why did they Why did the BJP win more seats than expected? So most people had expected them to win, but by fewer seats. And, so I used to write columns at the print, and Shekhar Gupta turned around to me and said, Ila, why don't you work on it? And I knew Mr. Bhupender Yadav, who then was General Secretary of the BJP, but on a lot of the standing committees. So, for example, for the FRDI bill, he was on the standing committee. He was the chairman of the standing committee in Parliament. So I used to be working with, on these bills, and that's why I knew him already. So I turned to him and I asked him to explain to me what had happened in the elections. And he had always seemed confident that they would get so many seats. And my angle, because I don't understand too much of politics, and I don't follow politics that. As an Indian, of course, we all follow politics, but not in great detail. So my question was, what was the role that what you did on the economics? What role did that have to play? And what I found out was that it had the welfare schemes, how the party reached out and so on, had a very big role to play. When we said, okay, let's write. I started writing about it, wrote a couple of columns. Then we decided we'll write that into a book. And when we started writing that into a book, we realized you can't do that without the history. So, then it's half a story. So then we also worked on the history. So we had these, COVID happened at that time. So I think we also had time when one couldn't travel, one couldn't do other things. I, of course, it was a huge learning opportunity for me to understand. And I feel that it helps looking at the history. And so we look both at the full history and at the recent history in the book. And a lot of people have told me that having read the book, they understand today's politics and BJP's politics, and because BJP is today at the center of Indian politics. So, everything is either BJP or against BJP. So many people feel that it helps them to understand reality, today's politics and economics better, as it did for me. So that's how. And then he became minister when the book was going into publication. So he was not a minister at that time.
Okay, so talk about this politics of welfare program. I mean, how do you see it working out in India right now?
So, we had 70 odd years, or as many as there were till 2014, when we would say, oh, we have all these schemes. And the Planning Commission in the previous 10 years during the UPA period had tried to consolidate the schemes, had tried to reduce leakages, had also initiated the Aadhaar UIDAI, had tried to, either do some things or not do them, but there was no radical, big effort to actually cut out all the corruption and cut out those schemes, focus on a few and get at least the SDG goals done, because you've been fast growing, this, that, and the other. Now, I think BJP came into it from two ends. The first, of course, is that they realized that growth has to be growth with people's participation. Remember the 2004 election. In the 2004 election, BJP had come in with an India Shining program. And at that time, they thought that, getting growth was enough. And realized, and that's there in our book also, we talk about it, that how the party says that they realize that it's not enough to get growth. What you also need to get is growth down to the last man in the mile, last Antodaya. That is to the poorest, in the remotest area, you have to get growth. So when they came in, I'm saying politically, that was the experience. And here, the effort was that we're going to hit the ground running from day one. that 2014, the day they come in, it actually they start doing all those programs. I think the first thing because I was in government at that time, within a month, the Jandhan and the decision to open bank accounts for the entire population, that decision came from the Prime Minister. And it seemed impossible. I mean, I can tell you that many of us would sit there, hold our heads in North Block and say, no, we won't be able to do this. I mean, how do you 70 years for 50% of the population? And then he said, do it in 2 months. Okay, just do it. Just go do it. Abhiyan chalaiye. Go into mission mode. Don't just sit back. Just do it. Find ways and go and start, at least give people bank accounts. So the energy with which, just the basics. And what are the basics? Today, bank account is basic, right? The basics are an identity card, the Aadhaar identity was required because it was Jandhan Aadhaar, so they were linked together. So that was also done in campaign mode. So when that was being done, first it one did not realize that these were the foundations for the world's biggest DBT. I mean, what actually got done was that then it wasn't that the government was going to go around, providing gas cylinders to everybody. Most of what has been done is that infrastructure got created, and on that infrastructure have run very, very big direct benefit schemes where money has flown through to many accounts. So the gas connection. Now, if you look at SDG goals, internal air pollution is actually very big. So that air inside the house hurts women and children. And until then, almost nothing had been done about it. Okay, so one big thing that was taken up was the Ujjwala scheme. That is the scheme which said we'll provide gas connections, cooking gas connections to every woman in the country. And when that started getting done, and then there's a subsidy which you can, first there was a give it up. So people like us who used to be forced to take a subsidy and feel bad about it, no longer needed to take the subsidy. And others, the poor, could apply through their Aadhaar and get money into those Jandhan accounts, their bank accounts, for the subsidy. Now, this whole vision was not something which was laid out or what was talked about. So I think part of what has happened is that people saw something happening. They, the one mission after the other, and they did not see the plan behind all of these. It took 3, 4, 5 years when they go back in 2019 to the public, that by then people have actually got a lot of, just these are just basic amenities of life. These are just, fundamentally SDG goals. What are they? A house, a toilet, drinking water, electricity, and clean air inside the house. So primarily these are the fundamental that people receive. The one important, I thought that the one important story which not many people know about is that when these schemes were being dispersed through the government system and the district administration and so on, the party would almost like a social audit. It would approach people and it would ask them, are you getting what you're supposed to get? Okay. And if there were any issues, they would go ahead and solve them. So that created a connect also between the party, because these were the objectives of the party, to give a better standard of living to the people and of doing it through government, but understanding that there are, rents and corruption and so on. So they managed to go and speak to people. So that's how they connected with them. That's how, and a lot of those people also became their members and started participating in their activities and supported them in elections. So that was the unique story of the 2014 to 2019 BJP period, Modi administration.
Fascinating. Very, very well captured, Ila. So is India's future a deeper welfare state?
Yeah. I don't know what is a deeper welfare state. So I don't understand the word deeper welfare state. I mean, what we are trying is that if there are people who are not able to, if there are children who can't go to school, or if there are people who are in such remote areas that there are no roads, then roads should be built, some houses should be provided. But if it means that people will be encouraged to not work, get unemployment benefits, stay at home, withdraw from the labor force, I don't think that's where we are going. So, I mean, there is a way, where we are very, very far from what we understand, what at least like, for example, what I saw as a student in the UK, where a lot of my neighbors were not working. And why? Because they had both housing benefit and unemployment benefit. And they would find some way of just showing that they were looking for a job, but they were not really looking for jobs. I don't think that's where we are going. I don't think we are going to be looking at, transferring income to hundreds and millions, crores. I don't think we can even afford it, but I don't think that's the philosophy. The philosophy is not of handouts.
Let me restate the question. If today per capita transfer is X, would it be X times 1.1 in real terms 5 years from now?
I'm not sure. Maybe a little bit more of transfers or a little bit less. So if when COVID happened, transfers went up. But if we manage to get more investment and jobs, then I think they'll go down. Because it's more with the intent of, if you have high growth, there are losers. There are people who will suffer, and you need to provide a social security a cushion to them, so that they don't fall off completely. I mean, so this is not a place where, if there are big shocks, that people would be left completely on their own. That's not this society. It's a society where, and it's just that, in the beginning also, as I said, that it's not that one gave 6% of GDP to households, even at the worst time when COVID hit. That is not what was done. I mean, other efforts were made to allow people to stay alive, maybe just giving them food, maybe grain, actually, not even food. What was given was wheat. So you saw almost everybody washing that wheat, because it wasn't all that clean, washing it, then going to mills, getting it ground, and then making it into flour, and then cooking it and eating it. So it's a different system. So I don't want to even judge it by, okay, 5 years down the line, will we be spending more? I mean, it could be that if money can be spent efficiently, then maybe, yes, it makes sense. So I would prefer public goods first and foremost. I would wish that it goes into clean air, it goes into roads, it goes into law and order, it goes into judiciary, it goes into just maybe now we may need to increase our military spending, but I wish it goes into public goods, and we don't need to do that much welfare. Yet I find that the welfare that is done, I mean, if I compare myself to a family that has received welfare, and I try to think of, oops, they should not have got a toilet. And I think of the number of toilets in houses like ours, and you don't even want to go there. You don't want to go there. You don't want to go there. So I'm not sure that we are a welfare state. I think it's, yes, you have to have social safety nets. You want high growth, you want people to take risks, you have to have social safety nets.
Absolutely. Ila, finally, in your view, and this is a very big picture question, what is India's promise over the next decade and the caveats? How can that promise go unfulfilled?
So I think our biggest strength is the youth, is the demographic dividend. Okay, that is India's biggest strength. One, it gives us a big market. Indian market, because everyone is doing something and therefore adding value, and therefore our GDP is going to grow. So we're going to have a big market. We're also going to be able to participate in production, in global production, more than anybody else because of sheer numbers. We are going to be the youngest country in the world. 50% people will be in their working age population. I mean, compare that to all, the kind of declines that you're seeing everywhere. You're seeing China, Europe, Japan. Of course, countries like the US and Australia, which are not seeing a decline, is because of immigration. But a lot of the other countries are in a difficult position, and that is going to be our biggest strength. What is it that, where can things go wrong? I mean, we want this population to be educated, to be healthy, to be to be able to contribute. We want, if we are unable to create an environment where entrepreneurship is valued, where people can take risks, where people can have both the ability, and so they should be capable of taking risks. So they should have received education, they should have got some skills, and they should also be in an environment where that's something that they can do. So we are a democracy. We are, I think that's another very big strength. So if we get governments that don't do so well, they don't stay for long. Okay, 10 years, and then, someone pushes them out. So governments know that they have to respond to all these young people who are looking towards them to create the right environment. But yes, of course, there's always a risk that that's not done properly. And then that would be very sad.
Very good. That was excellent. Ila, thank you so much for your time and insights.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks to our listeners as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge from Spy Studios. Daisy Sharma and Violet Lee provided additional production assistance. Kopi Time is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 85 episodes of the podcast are available on YouTube and all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, Spotify, and Amazon. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.